I'm very pleased to be here this morning to talk about the progress that we've made for the state of Illinois since I took office a little over 4 years ago. I came here, I met a few of you who were here 4 years ago. When I came, I was the first governor in, I think, more than 20 years to meet with the credit rating agencies, the bondholders here in New York, and talk about the fiscal condition of the state and what our plans were for the future. I reminded actually the people who were here 4 years ago, would you mind raising your hand just so we can see there were a few of you? Good. So you all who weren't here 4 years ago, you can come and talk to them about how, everybody walked in the room kind of staring at the floor and wondering, where is this state going? And the good news for me is that the bar was relatively low. The governor of the state before I became governor had told the bond rating agencies that he didn't care what our credit ratings were for the state. That's a great way to invite people to invest in your state. And indeed, I think he may have shown it during his 4 years in office. So when I was running, there were people who said to me, maybe you don't want to be governor of Illinois because the state may have to get the federal government to allow it to declare bankruptcy. I mean, that is not a great invitation to becoming a candidate for governor of Illinois. But we knew we had problems. I knew that they could be overcome. And I think we've proven over the last 4 years that we've made tremendous progress. So let me begin by reminding you about what the progress has been over the last 4 years, and we're going to go through a series of slides, and I'll try to answer questions at the end of it, but I want to give you an overview from my perspective. You all have in front of you those slides, but at least I can talk through them and give you a little more color. So let's see, I've got this contraption in my pocket to move the slides forward. Here we go. Okay. So this is a very important summary slide, and I want to point out that when I came into office, Ann pointed out we had $17 billion of a bill backlog. The reason it says 8 up there is the state went and refinanced a bunch of that overdue bill backlog. Didn't pay it off, it just got a lower interest rate on it, and we pay 12% for overdue bills in the state of Illinois. So paying those bills off is a pretty big deal. But I came in, there were $8 billion. They couldn't finance more than they did. So there were $8 billion of overdue bills that we were paying this very high interest rate on. Today, we literally are running less than 30 days accounts payable. This is what I would describe as normal and will remain so for, in my opinion, for years to come. So we've made enormous progress in paying off those debts. The rainy day fund. Now, this is not a typo. We had $60,000 in our rainy day fund in Illinois when I took office. It got up to, at the very beginning, 20 years ago when it was created, it had been at $250 million. This is for a state that had, 30, 40, now $50 billion budget, and it had a $60,000 rainy day fund when I came in. When we had surpluses, I made sure that the legislature knew how important it was for us to save our dollars to make sure that we were investing in the future and the challenges that we may see in the future. And it wasn't just because we had just gone through a pandemic. We were actually in the middle of the pandemic while we were socking money away in our rainy day fund. But we're not only at $1.9 billion now, but we have more money that is scheduled to come into the rainy day fund over the next several years. I'll just give you one example of ways in which we're managing dollars to go into the rainy day fund, which I think is very important, not just for our credit ratings, but for the security of the people of the state of Illinois. Here's one of the things that we did. So when we restored our unemployment insurance trust fund in the state, we loaned $450 million to that fund, in addition to using ARPA dollars to pay off the rest of the unemployment insurance trust fund debt. $450 million from the general revenue fund, but the payback is going directly into the rainy day fund. So that was one way in which we knew that we would be able to increase the amount of money going into the rainy day fund in the future. So $45 million per year over the next 10 years will go into the rainy day fund just from that transaction. And then there are a number of other ways, including in our cannabis legalization and other ways, that we're putting money away for the future in our rainy day fund, hoping never to have to go, dip into that fund. Our credit ratings have significantly improved. We've had 8 credit upgrades since I took office. I'm proud to sort of cite that 8 credit upgrade number because my predecessor had 8 credit downgrades in 4 years. So in roughly 4 years, we got 8 credit upgrades, actually in more like 2.5 to 3 years. But during my term in office, anyway, I'm very proud of that. We have more that we need to do. We know just to become an average credit state in the United States, we have work to do, but we're on our way. Our legislature understands the things that we need to do to get there, and we are making real progress. You can see our economy is growing, and maybe the most important line on here is this pension funded ratio is improving and increasing. We will talk about later in a later slide how we're able to do that, but you can see that since 2019, our funded ratio is up to 43.8%. This is a graphic of something that is important to recognize about. When I came into office, we did a study. In fact, it was in my first month in office. What is the structural deficit of the state of Illinois? That was the question I asked my team to publish, not just tell me, but put it out publicly. And the answer was more than $3 billion. So in again, almost $40 billion or $40 billion budget, $3 billion of structural deficit. So at least we could all see what the problem was so that we could all address it together. And this is a representation of what the projection was. This is a projection, by the way, we do every year, looking forward 5 years to see what is the fiscal situation, the budget balance for years forward. So the red bars are that forecast that was done published late in 2019. The blue bars are the forecasts that were published late in 2022. I think the important thing to note about the blue bars, not just that they're smaller than the red bars, but also that really we've stabilized at a much lower level what that structural deficit is. Is it disappeared? No. We have, again, work to do. But out of a $49.5 billion budget, to have, projected forward $600, $700 million at its height of projected deficit means that we are a hair's breadth away from eliminating that structural deficit going forward. And I am focused on that and have been since the very beginning of my term in office. We did a bunch of things. They're listed in very small print at the bottom, but we did a bunch of things to the people, and there are folks in the political world who want to say, oh, this is really all about federal money coming into the state and what happens when the federal money goes away. Let me be clear. We made structural changes in our tax system in Illinois before the pandemic started and during the pandemic that are having real impacts, positive impacts for the state. At the same time, we have projected lower revenue coming in to take into account that there was federal stimulus in the economy that was helping the state of Illinois. And so we've been ratcheting down essentially the amount of revenue that otherwise you might project going forward if you were being, let's say, unrealistic or less conservative than we are. It's been my focus to be conservative about this. I want to beat expectations, not underperform. And I want to give credit to our director of the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, Alexis Sturm, who you're going to hear from in a little bit on the panel, for every year directing us exactly in this, in this way to make sure that we're projecting conservatively. And indeed, the legislature's arm that does these projections has pretty consistently, at least recently, projected higher revenue than we've projected. And that's, and they're really a very bipartisan, apolitical group, and so I'm kind of proud of that. And by the way, we have exceeded our revenue estimates each year for the last number of years. So I didn't go through what those structural tax changes are, but suffice to say, I'd be happy to go through that later for you. But we broadened the sales tax. I'll go back one. We broadened the sales tax in Illinois to cover online retail. We closed some corporate loopholes that really were unlike any other state, and so we brought ourselves in line with a lot of other states. And then we negotiated a bunch of health insurance contract savings, which have brought ongoing savings for the state. And then by paying off our short-term and medium-term debt, and really we have no short and medium-term debt left in the state. We've paid everything. We found every nook and cranny. I mean, if there's something left, it's relatively smaller than anybody would pay attention to. And so collectively, less interest payments and the change in revenue has made a big difference in our structural balance. This is just a representation of the accounts payable. You can see what's happened since before I became governor, and then during the time I've been governor. We've been focused on paying down all these debts for some time now, and I feel very confident that we have this now under control. But I also recognize that things can happen in the economy. I think what I would say to you is, and again, this is me speaking as an individual, I look at this and think that if you thought about us as a 30 days payable kind of, we aren't, we're less than 30 days. But if we thought of us as a 30 days payable operation, we could run that number up. I don't want to, but we could run that number up to $2 to $2.5 billion and still be paying our bills on time. And some states are paying them in even longer term than that. But I think we're doing well as it is. This is a representation of that budget stabilization rainy day fund. You can see the drastic difference between before and after, and that number to the right is only going to get bigger. That's our intention. That's our focus. We keep raising this with the legislature. You can imagine, you're always in a debate about whether there are social services, for example, that need to be funded, or education that need to be funded. At the same time, you're putting money into the rainy day fund. I think you can do them at the same time, and we have been. The legislature's been amenable to that and understands why it's important, I think. So I think, I guess the only other thing I'd say about this is that we never got to more than about $275 million, in those reasonably okay years, and then we really have said to ourselves that number should be much higher than it is today. That there are folks who say that you shouldn't have less than 5% of your budget in a stabilization fund. We think that's a minimum also, and we're working our way to that number, very close to it now. And believe that we can get much farther along. I think this is an interesting slide because I don't know if we've ever presented something like this before, but here's what I would say: we have had strong cash balances even when people thought Illinois was having real trouble. But you can see that even when the pandemic hit, we had good cash reserves. But we've been working on continuing those cash reserves. Again, when we say paying off debt, for example, some of that debt has been to our own internal funds that were borrowed from in years past. We had debt owed to trust funds and to state segregated funds that had been borrowed in years past. We've paid those back. That's part of the short-term debts that we had to pay back. And so you can see that we now have a significant cash reserve that's made a real difference for Illinois. The $22 billion is roughly where we are today. We think that number continues to go up, and you'll see going forward that the intention of those funds is being adhered to, so the funds are there to pay the things that are necessary going forward that they were intended for. Our pension obligations. I know there's an awful lot of discussion about Illinois' pensions and has been for a lot of years, but I'd like to start by pointing out that we passed a bill back in 1994 that required the state to pay into the pension funds to aim at 90% funded by 2045. It's not 100%, but it's 90%, and we've stuck to that every single year. There's never been faltering from that, and market ups and downs, the actuarial assumptions change over the years, but we have paid in the and it adjusts every year to the actuarial assumptions and to interest, inflation, et cetera. It's gone up over the years. We've never missed a payment. And indeed, over the last 2 years and in this current operating budget that I've proposed, we're paying more into the pension system than we are required to by that law. That's never happened before in the last 27 years. We put in 200 and 300 million more over the last 2 years. We propose putting another 200 million more than is required in this fiscal year upcoming. And that's something I think is important for us to continue to do as a state. Whatever we can do to shave off the unfunded pension liability is something that we ought to do. I want to add that we also passed a law prior to my coming in office. The legislature had passed a law to allow a pilot program for people to get bought out of their pensions when they would retire. I thought that was a really good idea. I wanted to see what the success rate of it was. There was a pretty good success rate of it. They're being bought out at 60 and 70% of either their COLA or their pension. And it had helped to reduce, in a small amount at the time, because there was only a pilot program, to reduce the pension liability. So I went to the legislature in 2019 and asked them to expand that to cover all of the pension systems and allow us to essentially finance that. And they did that. And it has made a difference. Again, billions of dollars. We're still at $139 billion of net pension liability in the state, but that number is being shaved off every year, in part by that pension buyout program that we put in place, in part by us putting more money into the system than we are required to. And we look for every which way we can in order to reduce that pension liability and continue to listen to folks who have good ideas about how we might manage through it, but recognize that it took us decades to get into the situation that we got into in Illinois. We are moving in the right direction, and it may take us a few years for us to get out of that, but as long as we're moving in the right direction, the legislature is doing the things that are necessary, the governor leading in that direction, I think you should have some confidence that we're getting where we need to be. I also should point out, and you can see here, that our targeted returns for the various pension systems have gone down over the years. We've set our targets at lower rates. We're exceeding that consistently. And I think that the pension systems are better run today than they were before. And we have, I think, more qualified people that are being appointed I'm appointing those people into those pension fund positions. And they're doing the right thing, and I think we've set a course for them to do the right thing in terms of their investments. I want to talk about the future of the state because, all of this, we can talk about taxes, we can talk about revenue for the state, but none of it really happens. The revenue doesn't anyway, unless you're growing your economy, and that's been my focus really since day one. I think all of you know I was a businessman before I became governor. I do not think you run government like a business, but I do think that when it comes to the fiscal matters of the state, the investments in the future of the economy of the state, you do have to think like a business person. And so I think about these things. Ann said it, but it's true. I think about these things not in what's going to happen next year or 2 years from now, but what are the investments that we're making now going to do for us 10 years from now and 20 years from now and 30 years from now? Because ultimately, I think, well, one thing I'd say is that's how history judges you. It's not in 1 year increments, right? It's over what did you do that made a real difference over the long haul. And so we're making a difference over the long haul. But let me start with some underlying economic indicators that I think are important to keep in mind. Everybody thinks Illinois' population is declining. I want to remind you about how you get that data. Every 10 years, a census is done where we actually count heads, so you know exactly how many people are in a state. But in between, every single year, the American Community Survey, which is essentially a poll, a big poll, does an estimate of what your population growth or decline is. Over the course of the years from 2010 to 2020, when I wasn't governor for most of those years, I looked at those numbers and thought, oh my God, Illinois is losing hundreds of thousands of people. This is terrible. What do we need to do to turn that around? And I came into office having proposed that one of the biggest out-migration numbers is the number of students that were getting up and leaving Illinois because they couldn't afford to go to an Illinois college because we weren't providing enough financial aid and tuition was high. So my proposal in part was, let's keep our smartest, best students in the state. Let's make it more affordable so they can go to school here, because roughly 70% of the kids that leave the state to go to college never come back to the state they came from. And in Illinois, if we can keep them here, they'll probably get jobs here when they graduate. So that was a focus of mine. A number of other things to focus on, just making life more livable and easier on working class people, particularly in the state, and middle class families. So worked on all that. Census data came in. Turns out the American Community Survey, way off. We gained population in Illinois over the last 10 years, according to the census, and that's shocking. It was shocking for me. Who would know until you count heads, but true. So now 2021's ACS data comes out and it shows we lost 100,000, or over the last 2 years we've lost more than 100,000 people. We've written letters, talked to the Department of Commerce, the Census Bureau, about what there's a problem with their estimations, that their ACS data and the way they put that together we think is wrong. Congressman Raja Krishnamurti has led that for us on the federal level. I also have spoken with them, and indeed in December of this year they plan to rejigger and change the way they do the American Community Survey. So I don't know what that'll do to our numbers, but I can tell you that even they recognize that their estimations, their ACS data is wrong. When I came into office, an important thing for me was invest in the things that really make for a long-term strong economy. One of those is Illinois is in the center of the country. We're the supply chain hub of the nation. We have a great transportation, distribution, logistics industry, in part because of our location. In part, we have all seven major railroads that go through Illinois. Anybody that wants to get their product to anywhere in the United States is best off manufacturing that product in Illinois. But you've got to maintain your roads and your bridges and your rail and your airports and so on. So I got the legislature to pass the largest infrastructure bill in the history of the state, $45 billion, and the federal government followed us in 2021 with a bill that will send approximately $20 billion more to Illinois. And so important to note, because we passed our infrastructure bill in 2019, when the federal bill was passed and you have to come up with your matching dollars, we were ready to go. We literally were shovel ready with projects in Illinois because we'd been at this for 2 years already. And so what do you know? I think we're now the second highest amount of money that's been granted to a state by the federal government, in part because we had the dollars ready to go. So I'm proud of the fact that, there have been a lot of ribbon cuttings, but most importantly, we've got smoother roads, we've got better rail, our airports are being upgraded, and indeed we're building new ports and rebuilding ports, river ports that carry a lot of cargo. And I guess on cargo, I'll add one other thing. We have the fastest growing cargo airport in the world in Rockford, Illinois. Maybe that's not an airport you're aware of, but I can tell you that it is booming in Rockford. So these are all things that I'm focused on, and they are really about the future. Companies that are thinking about coming to Illinois, it's a bragging point for us when I talk to manufacturers in particular who want to come to Illinois, and I'm on the phone with virtually every major company that's thinking about Illinois or that I think should be thinking about Illinois. I am personally on the phone. I'm, told people when I ran that I would be the state's best chief marketing officer, and I'm also the state's best chief sales officer, and we've been working very hard, and this is one of our great selling points, along with the high talent and highly educated workforce that we have. So economic development, look, without going through all these bullet points, I think there's an important couple of notes that I would make to you. We happen to have some of the best universities in the world, and in particular on things that people haven't paid a lot of attention to until just recently, and that's quantum computing, molecular science. It happens that University of Illinois, University of Chicago, Northwestern are some of the best in the world. And we are the focal point for the Midwest and all the other great universities like Purdue and others, University of Wisconsin. So when the opportunity came up in 2019 for the state to catalyze the energy department to put money into Illinois for quantum, when it was putting out billions of dollars in grants, the state stepped up in my infrastructure bill to put $200 million into the development of quantum infrastructure and bringing the University of Illinois, University of Chicago together in that endeavor. We, as a result of that, received the largest amount and the largest number of quantum grants from the Department of Energy. That's a big deal, because whoever wins this race for quantum is going to become the Silicon Valley of quantum in the next 10 years. And so I think of that as an investment in something that maybe most people don't pay attention to in their daily lives in Illinois, but it's something that will make a big, big difference in the economy of the state. And we are winning even now. We've got quantum startups that are coming out of the Chicago Quantum Exchange. We've got an accelerator called Duality, which is producing new startups. And I feel confident that we're on our way. And that's just quantum. We also moved, the University of Illinois has a lot of talent. University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign is in Champaign, which is 2.5 hours from Chicago. And we wanted a lot of that talent also to be able to do business and educate people in the Chicago area. And so we invested $500 million and brought $500 million of private investment into something called Discovery Partners Institute, which is really about the development of talent in these, very high research-related, science-related future opportunities for our economy. It too is making a big difference. They're building their new center even now, although they're already located in Chicago. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we have vaulted from back of the pack to number 2 in the country, fastest growing data center builders in the country, Virginia being number 1, we're number 2. And that's because we passed an incentives bill back in 2019 that just put us on par with most other states. But again, because of our location, it's been a boon for data centers in Illinois. We had $4 billion built of new data centers over the last couple of years. We have $4 billion that are started and starting right now. Last couple of things just to add to this, we're the 5th largest state for installed capacity for wind energy. Once again, important as we're trying to sell the state, as I'm on the phone or on Zoom or in person with companies that are thinking about where they're going to go, they're asking us about, what can you provide us in renewables to power our plant, whatever that may be. We're winning in part because we passed the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. It's really the best clean energy bill that's been passed in the entire country. We passed that in 2021, and it has further accelerated our wind and solar energy build out in the state. We have 7,000 solar applications that are in process right now, and again, new wind energy being produced. And I guess the last thing, again, thinking about the future is that, and I talked to somebody here about this, but the investments that we've made in education make a big difference, as you know, for a future of a state. Making sure that kids can afford, I say kids and adults, can afford to go to college is a big deal. And as a result of the work that I've done with the legislature, the amount of money that had been available for scholarships for people to go to college in Illinois, for Illinoisans to stay and go to college in Illinois, private and public colleges, by the way, in Illinois, has gone up 75% from $400 million to $700 million as a result of the current proposed budget, which I believe at least that piece of it will survive. I think most or all of it will. And it's now possible for somebody to go to community college in Illinois for free between Pell Grants and what we call MAP grants. Those are our state scholarships. And then add to that we were ranked by U.S. News & World Report recently as #1 in the nation for K-12 education among the top 10 most populous states in the country, #6 overall, beaten by some smaller states that I won't name. But suffice to say that we're making real investments in education and it's paying off. I believe that we have a terrific future, and we've set ourselves up in that way, in a way that I think will be recognizable to all of you about, how states become leaders. We have a lot going for us, as you know. To start with, I think none of you that are already invested in Illinois bonds misunderstand that. I think you know that there's some fundamentals that Illinois has that even if there's been mismanagement in the past of our fiscal situation or of the economic direction of the state, that the state still was on a positive trajectory, in part because of our geography, in part because of the talent that we have in the state, the fact that we have a great global city that leads our economy in the state. And then, if we just play our cards right, manage well, we can accelerate the growth of the state, and we're trying to do that. We've made tangible, real fiscal progress in the state. We've addressed the short-term and long-term debts. We're, whittling away at our long-term debts, bringing them down. We've really eliminated our short-term debts, and we're preparing ourselves for the future, and we're investing in areas that we think will pay off in a big way for our future. I guess the last thing I'll point out, and then I'll sit down, and Paul will come back up, and we'll take your questions, and he'll moderate. I really believe that my job as governor is to focus on lifting up the people of Illinois, making their lives easier. And the way to do that is to make sure that our fiscal future is stable, that we are growing the economy, and our job production in the state continues apace. We have more jobs available in Illinois today than we have people. That's not an unusual thing maybe for you to hear these days because there's a labor market shortage, but that's not something I've ever seen in the economy of the United States during my lifetime. And certainly in the state of Illinois, we are seeing that, every industry is asking us to train people for the jobs that they have available, and they know that they've got to compete for wages. And I'm working at attracting people who live in surrounding states, not to mention in states, that are far-flung, to Illinois, because we have a better opportunity for them. We have better, bigger companies for them to come work for. We have a startup economy that's being stoked and growing. We haven't had the stats come out for the last year, but for the year before, we created more small businesses than any of the top 10 states in the country. and that includes California and New York and Texas and Florida and so on. We have a great opportunity, I think, as a state to grow, but we have to focus on it, work on it every year. I'll be here for about 3.5 more years, I hope. And I think importantly, the progress we've made over the last 4 is just the beginning. So thank you all for coming today, and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Governor. And to answer your questions, we've brought the state's senior team, in addition to the governor, in the form of Deputy Governor Andy Minar, Ann Caprera, Chief of Staff, and Budget Director Alexis Sturm. And among this team, if there is not an answer, if we don't have an answer, there may not be one, in which case we'll tell you. One note as we get settled here about the importance of investors to the governor and this administration. In the early days of the pandemic, I was in the office every day, and there was just with everything going on, and there was virtually nobody in the building. And sometimes the only person I would see was the governor on the way to his daily press briefing. And on the way, my office is on the way to the press room, and he would pop his head in the middle of everything else, reading about the pandemic, figuring out all these other things, and he would pop his head in and say, what are investors asking? What are they saying? What are they thinking? As well as the rating agencies, because it remains very much a priority. So with that, we will have microphones coming around the room. We highly encourage you to ask questions. Now's the time. We'd love to have you do it. And so raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone around.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you very much for your time this morning, and congratulations on all the fiscal strides by the state. Quick question. A lot has been written about states across the country, Illinois included, benefiting during COVID about tax receipts exceeding budgetary expectations, particularly among high-income earners, coupled with unprecedented fiscal aid from Congress. My question is, with this federal aid now coming to an end, concerns of an economic slowdown and/or recession, are the goals of Illinois State that you just went through, do they remain achievable in a slower economic environment and/or recession? In other words, we're not going to be going backwards with the state of Illinois, depending upon a different economic environment coupled with lower federal aid. Thank you.
This is live, yeah. Can you hear me okay? So thank you for asking that question, and I pride myself on the fact that from the very beginning, we never assumed this was something that was going to last forever, right? That, there's obviously been enormous federal stimulus directly to people in Illinois who have spent those dollars or are spending those dollars. There's also been, ARPA dollars coming directly to the state. And one thing that I made clear, and I want to hearken you back to a letter that I co-signed, I wrote, and my the Speaker of the House and the Senate President and I all edited and signed, that was in Crane Chicago Business. And it was in 2021. And what we essentially said was, these ARPA dollars coming to the state, we need to spend those on one-time things, right? Because this is not money that we're going to see again. We need to invest in the things that really matter for the state, to keep people healthy, to get past this difficult economic time. So that's just one indicator to you of what we were thinking from the very beginning. And we've thought that all along, and that's why for example, the revenue estimates that we've made for the last couple of years have been continually more conservative to make sure that we're taking into account that we don't have an endless amount of revenue coming to the state. Now, have our ambitions for the state changed? Not since I took office. I mean, the ambitions that I've had for the state remain. I don't think we set, some enormous, high bar for what we thought we would achieve with the temporary dollars coming in. What I knew was we needed to sock those dollars away in paying off debt, doing what we could to right the fiscal ship for Illinois. We continue to do that. These guys hear it from me all the time, that this is not, we should not be creating a bunch of new programs to spend money on in the state. We need to, we needed to fill in the hollowed out government that was left to me after 2 years of no budget before I became governor, and we've done a lot of that. But the idea that we're going to be swimming in dollars going forward, or that we could do less to create, new economic opportunity in the state, that's not something that. We are focused on being rational and reasonable while still having very high expectations about our future.
Thank you all for coming today. It's a very strong statement about what you think about the finances of the state. But I had a question with respect to, I know, Governor, you mentioned about Illinois already being one of the largest recipients from the Infrastructure Act, but I'm curious, the level of detail that's involved in legislation like that, have you found it, first of all, that it slowed the implementation of capital projects because you've known that there are federal funds coming, so you've kind of delayed what you otherwise would have done because you're working through getting the federal dollars together with your dollars in order to make the project happen? So is it slowed down the pace that you otherwise would have pursued on these particular projects? And secondly, just to follow it up on the comment you made about people available to work, have you found the availability of labor, and in particular in construction, has been a problem in terms of moving some of these projects forward?
That was going to be my answer to the first part of your question. The only thing that slowed us up, to the extent it has slowed us up, is just the availability of labor. And believe me, every time I run into a trade union or anybody constructing anything, I always say, how are you doing at attracting new apprentices? Are you bringing new people on? How fast are the jobs moving, and so on? And for the most part, you're hearing good things. I want to hear there are more and more apprentices getting hired. And at the same time, I have not heard, the labor shortage is just affecting everybody and everything, right? And then add to that, there have been some supply chain issues also that have affected our ability to build. But it's not because we were waiting around for federal dollars to come in. Again, as soon as those dollars have been available, we've gone after them, and evidenced by, we're the number 2 state to receive dollars so far. And that's, again, because we were ready to go. And, we have projects in our multi-year plan that are, on tap any moment that we have labor available to fill those opportunities. Do you want to add anything to that? Yeah.
Hello. Thank you, Governor, for coming, and thank you to the team as well. I have 2 different questions that I'm going to ask them at once and hand the mic back. The first one is related to pensions. Do you have any conversations about sort of things that you could do structurally that might bind administrations after you to maybe exceed the 90% funded pension ramp? Like, what sort of conversations do you have around that? Because I think it's very, you deserve credit for making prudent fiscal decisions, but you might not be around forever, right? And some people might have to make some tough decisions. So just thoughts around sort of long-term actions you might be able to take. Second is around the city of Chicago. When you're on the Zoom calls with business leaders trying to attract businesses to the state, obviously Chicago probably comes up. There were some proposals from the newly elected mayor that might not be exactly what the business community is looking for. So if you could just talk about Chicago and the other issues that are come up there.
Yep. I want to remind you that the plan that I talked about that's focused on 90% funding of the pensions has been in place since 1995. So we've been at this for 27 years. We're about to, during my term, we're going to cross over the point where we'll be less than 20 years toward getting to that goal. And I think that's worth noting, just the level of concern that I think people should have about our ability to get where we said we would go should be lessening every year as we are meeting our obligations and as we are shaving off that net pension liability. That doesn't say that we shouldn't always look for more to do, but I just want to maybe set the tone. Yeah.
Can I just add so you can respond to it? It is very backloaded, so it's going to require a lot of difficult decisions down the road. So you definitely have made that progress.
I just wanted to put that out there so you could respond to it.
Well, when you say it's backloaded, that's actually, I mean, I guess I let the experts to my left talk about that, but I would argue that it's not, and that we're already at the point where, there's a graph that I have internally. We don't provide it, but it's, one that I pay attention to, and it's what % of our budget going forward, just assuming normal growth rates in the economy, normal growth rates in a budget, what % of our budget needs to be dedicated to paying the pensions in the state of Illinois? And the graph that I have, with the projections going forward, is that number is at or below 20% of our budget. Now, that you may think that's a large number, but that number was more before I came into office. And it's come down steadily. And again, going 2045 is when that 50-year timeline ends, and we will be at 90% funded or better. And I always say that I want to be the guy who becomes governor in 2046. So he doesn't have the pension challenge that we have today. But as long as that % of the budget remains at 20% or below, it's manageable for the state. So it's not something we need to panic about, or that needs massive structural change. Again, I'm always looking for ways to address this, but I want to remind you that we have addressed it. We passed a Tier 2 pension system in Illinois before I was governor, in fact, 3 governors ago, in 2011. And it lowered significantly the amount that was being put into or required for pension payment or pensions going forward for state employees joining at that point and forward. We this year have reached the 50% mark of the number of people working for the state that are in the old Tier 1 system and the number that are in the new Tier 2 system. That should be an optimistic note for anybody that's concerned about our pensions. Look, I have put forward ideas, some of them that were less well accepted than others, about how to deal with pensions. I believe that because of the Supreme Court decisions 10 years ago or more, that we have to pay our pensions. I also think it's the right thing to do, to pay people the pensions that they're owed. And the structural change that was made is making a big dent in the curve, the pension curve of what we need to pay into our pensions going forward. So when you say back-end loaded, I think we're in much better shape than we've been in really for quite some time. Do you want to add anything about pensions and the direction?
I'll go. I would echo the governor's remarks earlier. If you step back away just from pensions and you look at whatever challenge it is, and quite frankly, this is one of our largest to maintain, the ability to work with the legislature on any matter and to manage our way through the challenge, I think, has been a hallmark of the governor's first term in the first 4 years. So even beyond what was presented in the slides to everyone today, the ability to actively manage the budget, to show that fiscal discipline makes a difference and that you can work with both chambers and the legislature to produce that result. That to me, having been in this varying positions in state government, is just a sea change from where we were just 4 years ago. So why does that make a difference with pensions? It starts with the governor saying we should pay the bill. So if there's a movement to move the funded ratio from 90 to 100%, there's no legislation to do that. There's discussions about different approaches to pensions. And I would just, reassure everyone that the governor's shown that his ability to work with the legislature to work through these challenging issues is a proven record today, which is very different than where the state was just 4 years ago.
I'm going to add one more thing about pensions, and that is I'm always looking, again, for new ways to attack this in a way that doesn't diminish the pensions that are owed to people who currently work for state government, but that diminishes the pension liability over the course of the next 23 years. I think that I've looked at pensions broadly. It's not just a state pension question. I realize that people are buying state bonds. That's your number one, focus for pensions. But it's also about what's happening in our cities, in our counties, et cetera. And one of the things that I got done that for 75 years people have tried and failed at getting done is consolidating the 655 downstate police and fire pension programs. These were pension plans that were, 20 million, 50 million, 100 million, some of them 5 million in their pension plans, right? And they were getting extraordinarily poor returns as a result of just having a very small plan. They were being individually managed, separately managed, and so on. What we did was pass a bill that, again, people have tried for many years to do, that consolidated the investments of those pension systems. And already we've seen not just a reduction of the fees that are being paid, because they're now in two funds, a police fund, a fire fund. I think they're at $7 and $10 billion each of those funds, as opposed to being individually managed in small amounts. But they're also seeing better returns than than the overall market would have been had they remained separate. So I just want to say that wherever we can see savings, like pension consolidation is an example, we're going to look for that at the state level. We're going to look for any opportunities, and we have lots of people who are throwing up ideas in the air to see whether there's progress that could be made.
And Governor, any outlook that can be shared to Brian's second question about the?
Oh yeah. So the mayor-elect has not taken office yet, but he starts, I think, May 15th, and I've had one meeting with him so far, and another one coming up later this week. I think that the mayor's biggest focus is making sure that we balance the budget of the city, while at the same time, focusing on the communities that really, for the most part, have been left out in Chicago and left behind. He made a bunch of proposals during a campaign season. Several of those he's de-emphasized. And so, you're down to just a few that I think are being debated, some of which are going to would require the legislature to give him the power to do those things. He's coming to Springfield on Wednesday to meet with the legislature and talk. I think that'll be something everybody's interested in hearing. But I guess I didn't mean to at the time, but when we were in front of the press together, I talked about one thing that I thought wouldn't be a productive tax that had been talked about, but I don't think he really, I don't know what his current position is on it, and that was the financial transactions tax. It's not popular in the legislature. It's not something that would be good or smart for the state, in my view. I know there are differing opinions about this, but I made that clear when we were in front of the press. Don't think I meant to let that slip out while we were talking. Got asked a question, but it is a position I've had since before I took office. The CBOT, the CBOE, the Mercantile Exchange, can easily route transactions elsewhere. And indeed, we're a state that isn't going to change our position on it, and we were competing indeed for some of the transactions that were coming from New York when that was a debate in New Jersey about a transaction tax. So,
Other questions?
Hi, Governor. Thank you and your team for coming in today. I have two questions, one on K-12 education and the other on renewable energy development. So on education, as we saw in the fiscal year 24 proposed budget and your State of the State address, that's a priority. Advanced Illinois has been calling for a $550 million annual increase in the evidence-based funding formula. How would your team address the future trajectory of EBF and annual increases to that funding platform? And then on renewable energy, as you mentioned, the state is very invested in wind capacity. Can we hear a bit more about the development of solar and wind capacity, where you guys think you are in that process, what the timeline will be for completion, and job training for both of those renewable energy sources as well? Thank you.
Well, lest I fail to call on one of the architects of the evidence-based funding formula for the state, I'm going to ask my deputy governor for budget and economy at the end here to start with an answer to that question about the EBF allocation.
Thank you, Governor. This wasn't a question I was expecting for this morning, but thank you for asking it. As you know, the governor's introduced budget that was given to the legislature back in February contains $350 million, which is the additional increment proposed for FY24, which is the statutory minimum on our trek toward equity in the state. You probably also know we have actually had one of the least equitable systems of funding in the country, and evidence-based funding has now gotten us on a very different path. We're aware of many of the advocates who are asking for more than the 350. And I think this would be a good opportunity for us to also highlight the governor's proposed investments in early childhood education, which is robust and which is the largest proposal that we've ever seen in state history that will have tremendous impact both for providers and public schools. So we don't see this, we don't see this as a competing conversation, but certainly we welcome the conversations about investments beyond the 350. But we also think from a budgetary perspective, all of these things have to be put in that same conversation. The legislature's back in session tomorrow, and there's a handful of weeks till the scheduled adjournment, and we expect this to be very much a big part of the discussion.
And can I just add to that piece that we also proposed a $70 million per year program to build the pipeline of new teachers for the state that is focused on what is in EBF, the bottom 170 school districts. So the ones that would benefit most from EBF funding, these dollars would go to them, because it turns out that about 80% of the vacancies that are available for new teachers are in those school districts. So hard to think, like Andy was just saying, it's hard to think of these things in silos, really, to just say, put money in EBF and that's the only answer. $70 million a year in teacher pipeline dollars going to those very same schools will make an enormous difference. And one could argue that all the dollars that we're putting into categoricals, in other ways to invest in K-12 education, which I think adds up to about $530 or so million, should count when someone's talking about what investments we're making in K-12 education. And one last thing, I've been in office for 4 years. I think we've increased by about $1.35, $1.4 billion the amount of money going into K-12 education from the state. Here's an important thing. People always talk about taxes in the state of Illinois. The reality is, if you take property taxes out, we're not a very high tax state at all. Property taxes have made an enormous dent in our reputation. And so one of the ways you deal with that is investing in education, because it turns out 70% of your property tax bill on average in Illinois is going to schools. Why is that? Because the state slowly but surely got out of the business of funding schools as a percentage, anyway, of the total funding for schools. Illinois got down to 24% of the total bill for K-12 education, 24%. We were nearly the last worst state in the nation. We are now back up at around 30% from 24. The average state in the United States is at 46%. of funding from the state, the rest coming from local property taxes and some from the federal government. But if you want to lower property taxes, put money into K-12 education. So that's what we've been doing. And it's it's all like a bunch of moving parts. The important thing is that we're lifting up funding for K-12 education and reducing the burden on local property taxpayers.
Did you have a second
Oh,
question?
sorry, you had another question about solar. So when we started debating CEJA, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in Illinois, we're blessed with having 50% plus 52% of our electricity produced by nuclear. And we had only 7% produced by wind and about 0.5% by solar. That's what it was a couple of years ago. We passed CEJA. We're now producing about 10% of our power from wind. Solar, still don't have a number exactly, but it's way up from 0.5%. But we do have a bunch of solar projects that we've cut the ribbons on. We've opened new solar in a big way. We funded solar credits in Illinois so that, the number of applications that came in is almost overwhelming. I mentioned 7,000 applications. But suffice to say that enormous progress is being made. I just don't have a number to provide you today.
Other questions?
Yeah, actually,
I don't think there's a button. I think someone's just in control.
okay.
There we go.
If I could just add on the solar piece and the passage of CEJA, this team sits with businesses that we're looking to attract into Illinois all the time. And there are two things when it comes to energy that they're always asking us about. And one is that percentage of renewable energy that we can provide off our grid, because pretty much every major corporation in America and worldwide has a commitment to be using some percentage of clean, renewable energy. That's regardless of your politics in any state. That is just where corporate America is right now. And the second thing they care about is the reliability of our grid. And in those two measures, we are able to offer numbers and commitments to businesses that really exceed pretty much all other major large states, and particularly, frankly, red states that in the past have attracted businesses with incentives and other things. They fall down on those measures because of the politics in those states, and we're able to come in and say, we'll give you a reliable grid and we will help you meet your clean energy targets over the next 10 to 30 years. And those are two major incentives when we're talking to businesses trying to attract them to Illinois and to keep them there, that you may not see in the press every day, but frankly, from a standpoint of when Andy and his team is out talking to these folks and trying to attract them to Illinois, it's a huge plus for us.
Thank you, Governor, and your team for speaking with us today. So at this point, I believe the only sector of the economy that hasn't totally recovered the number of jobs is state and local employment. So just wondering if you feel good about the size of the state workforce right now, and if you're having a tough time filling jobs, and if you have a handle on how the local economies within the state are feeling as well. Would love to hear about that.
I'll begin the answer to that by telling you a little background and then a direct answer to your question. So Illinois, I think, has the lowest number of state employees per capita of any state in the United States, and that was the case before the pandemic. If we're not the lowest, we're the second lowest, but it's darn low. One of the reasons is over the years we've reduced from about 80,000 state employees to about, what are we at, 50-some thousand?
Yeah,
Close.
60.
60, almost 60. So I know I said that because a little bit defensively, because there are people who think, oh my, bloated government. We started with a government that was already, reduced significantly over a number of years. The result of the pandemic, and I would say the post-pandemic economy, which isn't so much a function of the pandemic anymore as it is with our population shifts, right? People retiring, at younger ages and not enough people coming into the workforce. But that, of course, has led to shortages in all of the industries. It is still true that in state government, we are having trouble finding people like in many other industries. And we're doing a lot to try to attract new people to all of the positions, particularly the most vital of the positions that are required. But we have a much higher sort of budgeted head count than we have actual number of people working in our agencies. And that's not purposeful. That's literally, it's difficult to find and run people through a process to become a state employee. But I'm going to again ask Andy to talk about this because he's been tasked with helping our agencies and helping our government to attract more people to become candidates and then get hired.
I'll give you one example to illustrate what the governor just mentioned. During pre-COVID, many years before COVID, the Department of Employment Security in Illinois, for example, had about 1,700 employees. In March of 2020, they were down to, I'm going to give you some rough numbers, somewhere around 800. So at the moment when those services were needed the most, the agency had literally bottomed out in terms of its number of employees. Now, that was for a different set of reasons. Those numbers were driven by budgetary cuts over the years. So 5% cut, 3.5% cut to operations, things of that magnitude year after year took its toll in the head count. So today, the challenge, as the governor said, that the state faces is not unlike private employers. Our largest challenge is most acute today in the 24/7 facilities, so correctional facilities, human service facilities, and that's where we've concentrated our efforts first and foremost. So the answer is yes, we need more employees in state government, like most employers in the private sector today in the state. And we've done things that state government has never done before, from ground level, community level town halls for recruiting, to identifying career pathways for state employees that could move up in terms of management roles. We're modernizing our intake system for applications. That has been very successful. Matter of fact, today, a year ago, our challenge was not enough applicants. Today, I would tell you we have a good number of applicants. Now it's getting those applications processed. We've even, going back to the earlier question about relationship with the legislature, the administration has filed legislation to help streamline that process even. And that's a conglomeration of negotiations with unions and how state law directs our state departments to hire individuals. So in short, the answer is yes. We need more state employees, particularly in our 24/7 facilities. And the administration is focused first and foremost on those.
Governor, could you comment on the convention and what you think it'll be doing for Illinois in the long run?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up. First of all, I think that there's a lot about Chicago that doesn't get enough attention, the things that are really great about our city, and they tend to get highlighted when you have a convention where the global media is covering everything about the city and everything about our progress and the people of Illinois. And so one thing it does is it brings in 50,000 people over a very short period of time. It has the potential for $150 to $200 million of economic activity just during those 4 days of the convention. That doesn't take into account all the benefit that comes during the course of the year, all the various delegations that come in to sort of try out the hotels and check out where they're going to have their parties and so on for those 4 days. And then I think, when you get chosen in such a public way, it I think brings generally very positive press to, what are the great things about Chicago that people want to come, that they would want to have the Democratic convention here. We won the the Rotary International Convention, which is bigger than the Democratic National Convention, and nobody paid much attention to the fact that we won that. But that will bring in an enormous amount of business to the state and to the city. So I'm very proud of that, kind of attention that we're going to get. I think it's good for Chicago, good for Illinois. It shows off, you all, the people who raised their hands who've been, were at the meeting that I had 4 years ago at Loop Capital, and the people who are here have been following Illinois. You've seen a lot of progress in the state, even in the city. You've seen upgrades for various institutions across Illinois, our universities, and others. And that's, just part of a story that I think will get told about real progress. And I think some of it will draw really, really positive attention to the administration and their efforts to bring back the economy broadly, because, we suffered like everybody else in Illinois and in Chicago during the pandemic, and we've seen that V that everybody else has seen. And then finally, all of think about the major bills that the president got passed: the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, the IRA, that are, helping the economy of the United States and making us more competitive worldwide, bringing manufacturing back on shore. We have all of that in spades to show off from Chicago and in Illinois. And so it'll be great, because I think that also will get a lot of attention. And because we were shovel ready in the infrastructure piece, there'll be lots of good, television angles for people to cover during those 4 days about the progress that's been made in the United States under the current president.
So, Victor?
Thank you, Governor, and thank you, team, for hosting this. My question is, we all kind of know the inflation story, and with bargaining agreements coming due, I just kind of, any color in terms of what the expectations are with those moving forward, and kind of like potential impact on budget. And second question would be kind of going back to the K through 12. You passed a recent legislature in terms of affecting Chicago Board of Ed, the composition of the board. And I know they provided the state legislation with a report recently, ultimately just making the argument that they're not being treated on par with other school districts. So I guess just more from your perspective, kind of how will this play out in terms of politically? Is there appetite to move towards that direction in terms of making them more on par, and can the budget absorb that? Thank you.
Again, I'm going to turn to Andy to talk a little bit about our collective bargaining agreements that are, in various processes of the state for this last couple of months and in the next couple of months.
Yeah, this will be a relatively short answer, but we're in the middle of bargaining right now. So what we won't have, I'm certain, is a situation like we had years ago in the state prior to Governor Pritzker being elected, where there was an impasse that ended up being very costly. I think I would argue also that has had an impact still even today in terms of state employment. So budgetary impact, lack of a collective bargaining agreement clearly has had an impact on the state even years after the fact. So we're in the middle of that process today. And I would just report generally that there's nothing out of the ordinary that's happening at the moment. Parallel course is the legislative session, which is scheduled to adjourn on May the 19th. One question we typically get is, how do those two things intersect? And today I think it's just very difficult to say. So that's probably not the update you were looking for, but obviously I have to be constrained in terms of how we answer that question.
And with regard to the Chicago Board of Education, as some of you know, we changed the law in Illinois to allow for an elected school board in Chicago. That was something that most major cities have an elected school board, and of every city in the state, every jurisdiction in the state, that has schools has an elected school board, and so it was kind of an inevitable change that took place. I don't know that it will have a lot of effect on the state's engagement. I think you heard me say earlier, we're trying to get dollars into our education system and get them spent wisely, of course. And the Board of Education that will be elected will have that same duty that the appointed board had. I don't know that will make an enormous difference in how the dollars get spent, although I think people will feel better represented, certainly in that argument. But I know that there's, it's always the case. Most school districts anyway feel like they're not quite funded enough or very underfunded. And as Andy said, we had a very stratified funding system for the state of Illinois, and we're working to narrow that to make sure that we're, allowing obviously the schools that are okay with higher property taxes in order to have better schools. But we want to make sure that every kid gets a good education across the state. And so Chicago has suffered over the years just the same kind of underfunding issues that I think most other school districts have. And it's our job to help provide the resources. It's their job at the local level to make sure that they get spent properly. And we're helping them along with that process, I think, with the decisions that we're making in Springfield.
So with that, I believe that we will wrap it up and let you get on with your weeks. A couple of quick notes. One, we appreciate the questions this morning, and we always appreciate them, not just because we're happy to answer them, but because it's a good window into what you're thinking, which we appreciate. So please, at any time, reach out to us, not just in the course of the bond sale, but over the course of a year. That's item one. Item two is, again, we are looking to go to market on Wednesday, if the market cooperates. It's for a number of different purposes that the governor touched on this morning. The biggest is the capital piece for Rebuild Illinois and other capital projects. We have a taxable series that will fund the pension acceleration portion. We have an IT portion, and then we are looking to do a refunding for savings as the market allows. You're also welcome to please keep in touch with your representatives of our senior underwriters, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Loop Capital Markets, as well as any member of our syndicate. We've got a great team put together. And with that, we thank you.
Can I just add one thing before you thank everybody? I want, for all of you who are closely following, our legislature has really done a great job over the last few years of being aligned in our goal to lift up our credit, to make sure that we're doing the right things fiscally for the state. And I hope you pay attention to that as we head into the last part of the session here, because if we weren't cooperating, if we were, fighting one another, well, you'd be back in the situation we were in before I became governor. But also that the leaders in the legislature really do understand that this is how we make a real, solid future, and that it's, I should add, and maybe this should give you some confidence, that it's been politically beneficial for the Democrats in the legislature, to do the right thing for our fiscal future, because we won the elections in what was supposed to be a red wave year in November of 2022, in part because people who were going door to door running for the legislature were able to say, we Democrats balance the budget. We Democrats are the fiscally responsible party. We're the ones who got credit upgrades for the state. Republicans voted against every one of those budgets. They're in the super minority. They couldn't have stopped them, but the truth is that they didn't vote for the balanced budgets that we got. And I think that's just an important recognition. One thing to have a governor who's, I think, heading in the right direction for the state, but another thing for us all collectively to be, working together to do the right things for the state. It's a harder thing to do, but that's something that we've done.
And this, as well as all of this, is why we appreciate you coming out this morning, because these are things you can't put in a PowerPoint or a POS or anything else. So with that, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming out.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.